Hi, I'm Dan, and welcome to a special The Horizon Awaits video. You know, there's a great national treasure that most people don't think about when they travel. Our presidential libraries. Since Herbert Hoover, every president has set up a library of the documents and memoranda from their administration. Generally, these libraries are not open to the public, but they also include a museum with information and artifacts from the presidency. These are open to the public and are really great museums if you have any interest at all in American history or just the celebrity of presidential families. We have a goal to visit all the museums when we travel. There's currently 13 of them. So in 2022, we made a trip with our RV across the southern part of the United States from Florida to California and back, and we had the opportunity to visit 5 more presidential museums. We also visited an additional museum that was, although not about a president, was about one of the most famous Americans of his time. So if you stay to the end of the video, you'll see that museum too as a bonus. So come with us to get a look at each of these 5 presidential museums and see if you want to add them to your vacation plans. This is a map of the 13 current presidential museums in the United States. We've previously visited Jimmy Carter's in Atlanta, George H.W. Bush's in College Station, George W. Bush's in Dallas, and Lyndon Johnson's in Austin. On this trip, we visited Harry Truman's in Independence, Bill Clinton's in Little Rock, Dwight Eisenhower's in Abilene, Richard Nixon's in Yorba Linda, and Ronald Reagan's in Simi Valley. So let's get started with Harry S. Truman. Harry Truman was the 33rd President of the United States, serving 2 terms from 1945 to 1953. His library is located in his hometown of Independence, Missouri. The main entrance is just past the gift shop by a wall with Truman's signature. The museum starts with information about Truman's family and his childhood, up to experience as a captain in World War I. He goes on to cover the haberdashery business he started when he returned home, which didn't do very well. His marriage to Bess and his entry into politics under the control of Mr. Pendergrass, who ran politics in Missouri at the time. He was selected as vice president by FDR in his 3rd term and became president when Roosevelt died in office. This made him in charge at the end of World War II and the use of the atomic bomb on Japan. This is the safety pin that was removed from the arm of the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki, which was given to Truman after the war. They also have a plaque that marked the spot on the USS Missouri where Japan surrendered and ended the war. The museum goes on to cover the post-war years, including the rebuilding of Europe and Japan, the division of Germany and Berlin, and the creation of the State of Israel, all of which were heavily influenced by Truman. When Truman ran for re-election in 1949, he was considered a long shot. The election is mostly remembered for his come-from-behind victory, and the Chicago Tribune printing the story of his defeat before the final count that night. The museum then has exhibits about his 2nd term, McCarthyism and the Korean War, but I'll skip past that and go on to my favorite part of all presidential museums, the recreation of the Oval Office. I think every presidential museum has an Oval Office. This one is an exact replica of what the Oval Office would have looked like when Truman was president. All of the artwork and the decorations are what was there when he was in office. Some museums will let you sit at the desk, some will for a fee, and some won't allow it. I don't think you were allowed to sit at this museum. The famous "The Buck Stop Here" sign was on Truman's desk is also displayed here. While the Trumans were in office, the White House had major structural problems and required a complete refit that took 3 years and added 2 new floors in the basement. Some of the removed sports are on display here, as well as information about the reconstruction. In the center of the museum is a courtyard and garden. On the right side is the office Truman used after his presidency. His office was left exactly as it was when he died, and visitors can look through the window and see the papers he was working on that are still on his desk. Truman walked to this office from his home almost every day for a number of years after he left office, and many celebrities and heads of states would travel to the small town of Independence to visit him here. In the middle of the courtyard are the final resting places of President Truman and his wife Bess. Just across from them are the graves of their only child, Margaret, and her husband. While visiting the Truman Museum, you can also visit the home of the president. He and his wife lived there for their entire marriage, and Bess continued to live there after he died. Unfortunately, the Park Service will not allow photos inside, so I can only show you the outside and the garden. I found the Truman Museum interesting and very well done, and I highly recommend visiting it if you have an opportunity to. Our next stop was in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the library of Bill Clinton. The Clinton Library is in the downtown area, right off the Arkansas River. The building itself is a long, box-like structure with 2 upper floors for the museum and a lower entry floor. On the riverside below is an outdoor restaurant called 42 Bar and Table, named for the 42nd president. On first entering the museum, you're met with the presidential limo used during the Clinton years. There's also a gift shop on this level, but the main museum is an escalator ride up to the first floor. The first floor houses display boards that cover the major events of each year of the Clinton presidency. There are also 2 rows of bookshelves that hold a large collection of binders of the presidential papers from those years. Of course, they're glassed in and you can't touch them as a regular visitor. The upper floor houses cases of memorabilia from his life, starting with his childhood and ending in his presidency. For example, the gown worn by Hillary at a state dinner is on display here, as well as a collection of the saxophones he played. This glass sculpture by the artist Chihuly was given to the president and was on display at the White House during his presidency. Unique to the Clinton Museum is a reproduction of the cabinet room as it was during the Clinton presidency. I've never seen another presidential museum with one. Each chair has a nameplate of the cabinet member who sat there. There's also a reproduction of the dinner table set as would have been set for a state dinner. Finally, we come to the reproduction of the Oval Office during his presidency. All the artwork and decorations are exactly as they were when Clinton occupied it. Including this statue of a gentleman who we'll discuss more about later. One thing I did not like about the Clinton Museum, and that prevents me from recommending a visit there, is that they have a rule you can't take pictures in the Oval Office. I mean, obviously I did, but I was warned by the staff that I wasn't allowed to do so. It seems they only allow their official photographer to take your picture for a fee. People taking their own picture cuts into the revenue, I guess. Given that it's a reproduction, so there's no priceless artifacts there, and every other library I've been to allows people to take their own photos, I wasn't too happy about that, so that ended our visit. Our next stop is Abilene, Kansas, and the library of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th president. Eisenhower grew up on the land that this museum and library occupy, and his parents lived here until his mother's death in 1946. Near the center of the museum grounds is this larger-than-life statue of Eisenhower in his military uniform. The grounds actually are larger than most of the presidential libraries I've ever been to, and there's 4 main buildings on the ground. There's a building that houses the library, which contains all his presidential documents and is really only open for researchers. It does have this ornate iron entrance, though, so it's worth stopping by to see just that. Then there's the museum, which we'll be spending the bulk of our time in. There's also this childhood home and a memorial chapel, which we'll visit later. The lobby of the museum is covered with murals that depict Eisenhower's life, including his childhood, military career, and presidency. This is also where you can purchase tickets to enter the actual museum. The first part of the museum proper covers Eisenhower's family and childhood in Kansas. It progresses to his marriage to Mamie, including the uniform and dress they wore at their wedding. And if you can believe it, there's a piece of their wedding cake on display. Some old cake. The next section covers his military career. From his appointment at West Point, which was not his first choice, by the way. He wanted to go to the Naval Academy. To his role as military advisor to General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines prior to World War II. During World War II, he was the supreme Allied commander of all of Europe. This museum has the table that the Allied leaders sat at to plan the D-Day invasion under his leadership, as well as the uniform he wore during this period. This was the staff car he used during the war. The next part of the museum covers his life after the war and his campaign for the presidency. He was so popular after the war that both parties wanted him to join them and run as president for their party. His popularity and his memorable slogan, "I like Ike," allowed him to win the presidency in 1952. There's also a room devoted to Mamie Eisenhower's life and fashion. It's sometimes forgotten since she's been overshadowed by Jackie Kennedy's mark on fashion later, but Mamie had quite an impact on popular style during the Eisenhower presidency. Her look was part of the iconic style of the 50s, and many American women copied her choices. Like every other president, they have their own china set made for state dinners, and there's an example place setting on display. There's a room that covers the major policies of his administration, which also has a movie about his presidency on a continual loop that visitors can sit down and watch. Then there's this display on the one accomplishment that most Americans today associate with Eisenhower, the Eisenhower Interstate System. Before his legislation on this, the high-speed interstate roads that we rely on for driving long distances didn't exist. There was only a patchwork of state roads and often went right through downtown areas with stoplights and congestion. The original rationale for the interstate system was to allow military convoys to easily move equipment around the United States, but the resulting impact on travel and commerce can hardly be overstated. Eisenhower also presided over the beginning of the U.S. space program and the Cold War with the Soviet Union. A gift from Nikita Khrushchev is on display, a replica of the space pennant that was on the Luna 2 spacecraft, which is the first man-made object to impact the moon. The final room in the museum covers his state funeral and legacy. This is a photo of his casket lying in state at the Capitol Rotunda in 1969. The flag that was draped over it is also on display. On the eastern side of the museum grounds is the place of meditation, a chapel with the final resting place of Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. Finally, Eisenhower's boyhood home is on the grounds, but unfortunately, it was under restoration when we visited in 2022, so we're unable to go inside. The one thing missing from the Eisenhower Museum is a reproduction of his Oval Office. I think this is the only presidential museum without one. Despite that, I highly recommend a visit to the Eisenhower Center if you're in the area and your plans allow it. We now arrive in Yorba Linda, California, and the museum of Richard Nixon, the 37th president. The lobby of the museum is dominated by the large presidential seal on the floor and the imposing painting of Nixon on the wall. Once you purchase your admission tickets in the lobby and enter the museum, you will encounter a different experience than most presidential libraries. Instead of starting with his childhood and the education he had, you enter an array of displays describing the major social upheavals in America in the years leading up to the Nixon presidency. When you pass through this area, you immediately enter the reproduction of the Oval Office during his presidency. I assume the museum's designers were trying to contrast the upheaval in the real world with the serenity of the office, or something. Anyways, this is an accurate reproduction of the Oval Office during the Nixon administration, and one of the great things about this office is you're allowed to move freely around the room and sit anywhere, including at the presidential desk. No charge. There's also a reproduction of the cabinet room during the Nixon administration. I know I said that the Clinton one was unique, but it turns out I was wrong. The Nixon Museum also has one. There's also a replica of the East Room of the White House, which is the largest room in the White House and is used for public events and concerts. It contains reproductions of the artwork and fixtures that adorn the actual East Room during the Nixon presidency, including the portrait of George Washington that Dolly Madison saved from the White House fire. The main area of the museum has sections devoted to the major policies of the Nixon years, including the Vietnam War and the space program. It was actually Nixon who spoke to the Apollo 11 crew on the moon with his exact phone. Also his foreign policies. He signed the SALT Treaty with the Soviet Union, and they have a piece of the Berlin Wall here, although that happened many years after Nixon, so he's also famously negotiated a treaty with China. There's an area devoted to Pat Nixon's clothing that she wore during their world travels. There's also a reproduction of the sitting room in the so-called Western White House in San Clemente on the coast of California, where Nixon would often travel during his presidency. There's a reproduction of the Lincoln sitting room, where Nixon would sit for hours and write on legal pads, as well as a section at the end of the museum on his early life and his service as a commander in the United States Navy during World War II. Outside, we find the entrance to the Presidential Library with its documents, and a nice courtyard with beautiful landscaping with a long fountain in the center, and the First Lady's rose garden in the rear. These gardens were designed by the First Lady to display the many types of roses she liked. This is also the final resting places of Pat and Richard Nixon. Behind the gardens is the home that Richard Nixon was born and raised in. It's open for tours at specific times of the day, but we didn't get a chance to go inside when we were there. Finally, at the back of the grounds is the helicopter used as Marine One during the Nixon's presidency. It is the exact helicopter that Nixon famously entered with his fingers in a peace sign to ride out of the White House lawn when he resigned from office. You're able to enter the helicopter and see how the president would experience leaving the White House on it. I've not included in this video, but there's a section in the museum that gives a good overview of the Watergate scandal and includes telephones where you can listen to excerpts from the Watergate tapes. The museum pulls no punches explaining the shortcomings of the president and where he went wrong. I really admired that. I enjoyed the Nixon Presidential Library and I highly recommend visiting it. I would say it's probably the best presidential library in my opinion. For our final presidential museum on this trip, we arrived at Simi Valley and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. The Reagan Library is on a beautiful hill overlooking the valley, and it may be the largest presidential library. There's another courtyard before you reach the main entrance, with a statue of cowboy Ronald Reagan. Another statue of Ron and Nancy is just inside the door at the front of the lobby. The museum starts with his early political life and his governorship of California. You then enter a room covering his presidential campaign through a doorway labeled A Nation in Crisis. That seems to be a theme in presidential libraries. They always take office when the nation's in crisis. His famous campaign slogan is on the wall as you enter. There's a mock-up of a stage where Reagan gave a campaign speech, and visitors are invited to stand at the podium and give their best campaign address. The clothes worn by Ron and Nancy during the inauguration are here as well, and it also has the suit he was wearing when he was shot in an assassination attempt. The sweater he wore when he was speaking to the public from the hospital after the attempt is also on display, and a few of the many canes the public sent him to use while he recovered. Next we come to a reproduction of Reagan's Oval Office. Sadly, this museum will not allow visitors to even enter the office. You can only look at it over the railing in the doorway. I guess they don't want people messing up the carpet. This is the china cabinet the Reagans used for state dinners, as well as a photo of them dancing during one of them. There's a collection of clothing Nancy wore during her time in the White House on display, too. There's a large hangar in the museum that holds the actual plane used as Air Force One during Reagan's presidency. I think this might be the only presidential museum with the real Air Force One. You can go on board the plane and walk around the inside. It's weird because this is the actual plane, and the Oval Office is only a reproduction, but they don't let you in there. The limousine used by Reagan is on display too. I don't know if there's a name for these cars, such as Limo One, like there is for Air Force One and Marine One. Speaking of Marine One, Reagan's helicopter is also on display in the hangar. They have a steel support beam from the World Trade Center on display, although his presidency was long before the September 11th attacks. There are, of course, many other displays and artifacts in the museums, and I'm only giving a few highlights. The last section of the museum covers his funeral and legacy. Outside, a piece of the Berlin Wall is on display. Reagan famously challenged Gorbachev to tear down this wall, which has arguably led to its removal in the long term. The rear garden of the museum is a replica of the south lawn of the White House, and it's also the location of the final resting place for Ron and Nancy. The Reagan Museum is a scenic location and has beautiful grounds. It's large and has some cool collections, but as a museum it feels more like a PR exercise than a museum. Every president has achievements and failures, but I couldn't see any criticisms of any of the choices he made in this museum. It's still well worth visiting, but I couldn't help thinking about that while I was there. And now for the bonus museum, the Will Rogers Museum in Claremore, Oklahoma. Most young people today, and truthfully even people my age, are not sure who Will Rogers was. But 100 years ago, he was one of the most famous people in America, possibly in the English-speaking world. Will Rogers started his career as a cowboy, doing rope tricks at rodeos and vaudeville. During his routine, he would do a monologue with jokes about the news and politics. He became quite popular. Before long, Hollywood came calling. At first, his movies were silent, but when talkies came along, he could add his wry humor to the films, and he became one of the most popular box office stars in America. He filmed over 70 films, many of them topping the charts. There's a small theater in the museum with his movies continually playing. There's also a larger theater that plays the documentary on the story of his life. He found another outlet for his political commentary and humor by writing a weekly newspaper column that was syndicated throughout the U.S. His championing of the common man made him popular with most Americans, and he became friends with many presidents and leaders. He also hosted a syndicated weekly radio show, which before TV was the main way Americans got their information. He was so beloved that he was referred to as the conscience of America. Will was an adventurer and a great fan of the new technology of airplanes. In 1935, when he was only 55 years old and possibly at the height of his popularity, he and his friend, the famous aviator Wiley Post, embarked on a journey by airplane to map out a possible new mail route from the West Coast to Russia. The plane crashed on takeoff from a lake in Alaska, and both men were killed. There was a national outpouring of grief that is rarely seen outside of presidents. The federal government and state governments ordered flags to be flown at half-staff. Almost every movie theater screen went dark for 2 minutes at 2 p.m. on August 22nd in tribute. Newspaper editorials called on President Roosevelt to declare a national holiday and a day of mourning. People from across America sent their nickels and dimes to build a memorial to Will. They raised $200,000 at the height of the Great Depression, and the state of Oklahoma matched it. Congress passed a bill to add $500,000 to the memorial fund, but Roosevelt vetoed it, as the committee had not yet decided what type of memorial to make. They finally decided on this museum, on land Will and his wife had bought for their retirement. Will, his wife, and 3 of his 4 children are interred on the museum grounds. I recommend visiting this museum if you're in the area, and getting to know one of the most popular stars of the early 20th century, and a great American. So that's the 5 presidential libraries I promised, plus the 1 bonus museum. If you have an opportunity to go visit a presidential library, I highly recommend it. I find them very educational. If you like this video and you want to see more of our travel videos, you can go to our channel, The Horizon Awaits. And if you like it, you can subscribe. Thanks for watching.